Hey guys! Today I wanted to do a brief showcase of the Demon Slayer for the female Slayer class. I'll be covering things like general playstyle, tips and tricks for some notable skills, Talisman Recommendations, some example rotations, and some gearing guidelines for endgame optimization. To start, Demon Slayer is a very straightforward and incredibly powerful pure dealer, and deals physical percentage damage, meaning she scales with strength and physical attack. So you'll want to reinforce your weapon, not refine it. Let's jump straight into her skills. First, we have her Soaring Blade series. Let's start with Draw. Draw is a interesting skill. It's a very low cooldown skill that does pretty high DPS, but you do have to position for it. You will actually move enemies like this. You'll actually knock them back and then perform this StarCraft Lurker kind of attack here. Pretty cool. But on stationary targets like the sandbag, obviously, they can't be moved. So you can absolutely miss this if you use it at like point blank range. So you want to make sure you reposition for these. Next, we have Thrash. Thrash is actually a very nice handy tool, not just for its damage, but also for the fact that it can actually cancel into and out of other skills. For example, if I use Draw, you'll see my Thrash, or even Bleeding Blades, you'll see my Thrash is still lit up. So I can cancel these skills into Thrash whenever I want, and then you'll notice that some other skills, specifically my sword-wielding skills, are also lit up during Thrash's animation. So now you can do things like that. You can cancel into basically whatever you want. And you don't even have to finish Thrash's 3-hit animation. Very cool. Next we have Impale. Right here. And Impale is really cool because it gives you invulnerability frames if the grab connects. However, if it does not connect, it gives you super armor for a very brief duration, but no iframes. So do be wary of that. And this can absolutely just flat out miss and whiff in parties with enough latency. That said, the DPS is very high. This is still one of your strongest tools for sustained damage. Next, before I move on to other skills, I actually want to cover her First Awakening passive, Offering for the Greedy. So this gives you a skill attack buff for 30 seconds after you create something called Fog, or a Fog. And when you hit enemies, you'll notice this blue fog appears. And when you hit something and create this fog, then you get this Offering for the Greedy buff. Why is this important? Because, let's say you are starting a fight and you do not have this buff active because you've been waiting, or maybe you're just doing a pattern. If you start with a skill like Giga Slash, right? That did 22,856 damage. But now I have the buff and I use it again, 32,570 damage. So always make sure you hit an enemy with just anything really to get this buff, and then you can start using your big one-hitters. Or naturally, you can start your rotation with something that hits multiple times, or there is a delay, or whatever. So keep that in mind. Next, we have Blade Retraction, which actually has a long-range stab that pulls enemies. It does have a very narrow range, but it will group enemies in front of you if they're hit, which is mildly useful. And the DPS is very high. Moving on to some of our other skills, we have Wild Thrash. This is generally not a skill that people max, but just a neat thing about this, you can actually mash the key to make it go faster, otherwise it'll be very slow. So you can mash it. But also, since it is a channeled ability, this can be dangerous to use, but if you press jump, it'll just cancel immediately with no animation. So you could just do even that. And you can use that to just get out of a hairy situation. Sanguine Choreography is actually a really cool attack. It creates 5 clones that seek out enemies on their own to perform an attack. These do have a range, however, so if you cast them too far away from an enemy, they'll just poof away. And only the clones that have an enemy in range will go attack. And if, of course, there are no enemies in range, they will just go away. So be wary of that. They do have a maximum range for detection, like that, and therefore you will lose damage otherwise. Next we have Sword Demon Strike, her level 45 skill. This is actually kind of interesting because it can be used in a multitude of ways. One is just on the ground. You just cast a skill and Dymas will appear, perform this multi-hit attack, and it'll stick on the enemy. Pretty cool. You could also use it in the air. And this is actually kind of easier to land in some cases. The range for the melee attack is a little bit wider in this form, for some reason. And happens a little bit more quickly. Is one better than the other? Not necessarily. I would say just completely up to preference. And possibly what enemy you're fighting. And then we have a version where you can hold up on Sword Demon Strike on cast, and now you will jump forward. If you do not input the skill again, you'll just land and Dymas will appear at the end of your jump. However, if you perform the skill again in midair, you'll actually perform the aerial attack like this, and it'll connect to any enemy that you hit. And this can be useful if, you're just very, very far from an enemy and you need to get back in there, and just, jump right in. Pretty handy. Next we have Usurper Phnom, and this is kind of a very important skill, not for its damage necessarily, but for its invulnerability frames, even with no enemies present and it not being a grab or anything of that sort. If you cast a skill, you are completely invulnerable during this animation. You can use this to cheese a lot of attacks and just cheat death and avoid getting hit. However, if you look at the tooltip, you'll see it says HP minus 598. I know it says minus 598, and it would seem like it consumes the HP. It does not. You can see my HP is 62,152. If I cast a skill, my HP does not go down. However, you cannot cast a skill if your HP is under 598, so it is an HP threshold. So be wary of that. If your HP is too low, you may not be able to cast it, and the threshold does go up with additional levels. So you'll see here, threshold keeps on going up, and when maxed with a contract, if you do not have above 3,366 HP, you will not be able to cast it. So please be wary of that. Next we have Giga Slash, one of her second awakening skills. And it says right there, use the direction keys to change leaping distance. You can just cast it as is to not move forward at all. You can hold forward to move forward slightly, and you can hold up while casting to go a little bit further. This is not that important, but if you want to close distance with the enemy, this can be helpful. And then finally we have Extremity. Extremity is kind of interesting because it has two versions. One is on an ungrabbable enemy, it'll just perform this downward slam and does a lot of damage in one hit. However, if you have a grabbable enemy, suddenly you perform this multi-hit swinging attack. And you can also control where the enemy ends up, either on the left or the right. And if you hold left, for example, you'll perform the finisher to the left. And if you hold right, obviously you'll go to the right. And if there are multiple enemies, you can actually gather them all up like this. Pretty cool. But do be wary that in party play, this can be incredibly annoying for your party members, as the enemy's sprites do move with your attack. So if you're playing with like a monk or a striker or even something like a weapon master, you can just drag enemies out of your party members' attacks. So please be wary of that. Next, let's get into Talismans. To start off, we have Bleeding Blades, which is not recommended ever. It increases the channeling of the skill by almost double, and the damage increase on paper is quite high, but it's just not worth it because, as you will see, it takes an entire century to perform the skill with the Talisman. It's just not safe and not practical. That said, if it's your only Talisman, maybe you could use it if you feel safe. But personally, I wouldn't even bother using it, even if it was my only unique Talisman. I would actually prefer to use, in fact, the rare Talisman over it. And then we have Sanguine Choreography, which I do not have, but this one adds a lot of clones to Sanguine Choreography itself, and also increases the detection range of each clone, making it much more reliable. And the DPS of this Talisman is actually the highest among all of our Talismans. This is actually very recommended. Personally, I'm not a fan of it, as I do lose a lot of frames when running dungeons with multiple enemies in the room, but otherwise, this is fantastic. Next, we have Usurper Phnom. And now, instead of performing the skill yourself, where you get invulnerability frames, now you install it in front of you, like this, and it will now super hold enemies. And this is actually kind of cool. This is pretty useful just in general use, especially in soloing, as it does super hold enemies. However, because you lose channeling and therefore the invulnerability frames, you do lose some utility in that regard. But in general, it's not really worth taking into endgame, as the damage is not as high as some of your other talismans. And then next we have Sanguinem Gladio, and this is actually quite strong, but the skill itself does have a very high cooldown. The range does get increased by a massive 20%, and it also lets you cancel into other skills. But overall, it's just not enough utility, and the damage is just okay. DPS is on the lower side, and therefore I don't quite recommend it. And finally, moving on to talismans that I personally use, Sword Demon Strike is a very, very popular talisman, as now, instead of performing the skill yourself manually and having to land it, you'll see it is now grayed out on my bar. And now, when I attack enemies with my skills, I can automatically tag them with Sword Demon Strike. So for example, like that. And now I don't have to animate the skill anymore. Pretty cool. And then we have Extremity, which is actually kind of nice. Now it'll always perform the grab immune version, where you just perform the downward slam, even on grabbable enemies. So no more swinging around your enemies left and right. It just performs this one big hit now. And also with the talisman, you can now cancel into other skills, even though it says only Soaring Blade skills. Basically any skill that uses your weapon can be cancelled into from Extremity, and this is very, very nice. You can even cancel into Impale, for example, if you're in a hairy spot and you need iframes. But you will notice you cannot cancel into Sanguine Choreography or Phnom and Pterodymus. So keep that in mind, but otherwise you can cancel into mostly anything. And finally we have Giga Slash, my personal favorite. This is actually really cool. So now, if you press your skill key, you will go up into the air instantly, and you'll just come crashing down. Now, a couple key things about this one. While you're airborne, if you do not press anything, you just stay in the air, off the map, and you just crash down where you cast it. That's pretty cool. But as you can see, it is quite slow. So what else can you do? You can press your jump key, and you'll land instantly. But also, if you read the talisman here, while airborne, if you enter the skill key again within a certain amount of time, you will move to and attack the strongest enemy within range. And it's a big range. And it looks like this. Now it brings me right to the sandbag. And the range is actually very large, but it is only in front of you. If you use it like this, for example, it will not track the sandbag behind me. But otherwise, it is very forgiving. And this is really fun. You can actually dodge attacks with this by just staying in the air for a little bit before you come crashing down. Pretty neat, as it is basically instant. In my opinion, it is just incredibly satisfying to use. And generally speaking, the popular talismans are Choreography, Sword Demon Strike, and either Giga Slash or Extremity. Some people prefer to take off Choreography Talisman, some people prefer to take off Sword Demon Strike Talisman. It is completely up to you. Any combination of these 4 talismans will work great. It's absolutely just up to preference. And now let's do an example rotation. This will be 30 seconds on a basic sandbag. No speed, no consumables, basically no gear, no talismans, no creature, nothing. Just 100% crit. Some key things to note about this rotation though. Your cooldowns are very long. There are only a couple things you can use multiple times, being Choreography. You'll be able to use this once at the start and once at the tail end of your rotation. Freed Blade, you'll be able to use twice. And apart from that, it's just Blade Retraction, Draw, Impale, and Thrash. Everything else has way too long of an animation and cooldown to use twice in rotation with no CDR. So this will be quite simple. I promise. Let's do it. That's about that. Obviously my awakenings are at the top. 2 choreographies also at the top. Pterodymus, Gladio, Giga Strike, Extremity, Sword Demon Strike, all very, very strong. Blade Retraction, very high DPS. Impale, very high DPS, even though my last one didn't quite land. 2 Freed Blades, I'm only using this as an SP dump personally. You can absolutely max this with the TP. And Soaring Blades, Draw, not that strong, I didn't use them that many times. I am quite slow with this setup. But overall, very straightforward, very easy to play. And now we can do a rotation with simulated gear. I have right now Mana Vortex Top for some cooldown reduction, as well as Dust Traveler Necklace, also cooldown reduction to simulate maybe about 3-piece Dawn or 3-piece Assassin. Just one source of cooldown reduction in gear. I'll be giving myself about 70% attack speed, as I am quite lacking in that department. Unlimited HP, 30-second rotation, and 100% crit chance, even though I'm very close anyway. Some key things to note about this rotation, however, is that I will be using full consumables, including a Mind Sim Potion for more CDR, and now I can use Extremity and Giga Slash and Sword Demon Strike twice in the rotation. I cannot use Gladio twice, and I can still use Choreography only twice as well. Freed Blade I can use 3 times, but I probably will not bother. And apart from that, it's the same thing. Just a lot faster. But you'll see me do my rotation like this, Extremity and Sword Demon Strike together, and canceling it into Giga Slash immediately. So it'll look like this. And it'll happen relatively quickly, so keep your eyes peeled. Otherwise, same thing. That's about it. As you can see from the chart, Giga Slash did an enormous amount of damage. Extremity also did a lot of damage. Sword Demon Strike, I wasn't quite able to land the finisher on the second use, but still did a lot of damage. 2 choreographies, Terradimus, Gladio, 4 blade retractions. I probably could have gotten another one in there. Just didn't have enough time. Thrash, draw. I'm sorry, impale, draw, thrash, and then 2 freed blades. Still a very straightforward rotation, but just much faster paced because I do have cooldown reduction. But not every build is going to have this. If you do go for assassins or if you have Dawn, etc., you'll probably be able to do something along the lines of this. And moving on to gear guidelines finally. Very straightforward. Having 1 source of cooldown reduction is in fact quite nice, but may not be necessary if you are maxing the Soaring blade skills, because they do have very low cooldowns, and you might not feel like you need any more CDR for these with a -7 potion in use. However, if you want to get Assassin, it does mean you'll be able to use more choreographies, Sword Demon Strikes, Gladios, and more importantly, Giga Slash and Extremity to shorten the windows of your quote-unquote burst damage rotations. That is completely up to you. On the other hand, you can in fact go a full burst damage build instead, opting for things like awakening damage and just boosting levels to increase the damage of your burst. That's absolutely viable. And so Sirocco sets, again, if you do want some cooldown reduction, Assassins is a fantastic set for cooldown reduction, as the opportunity cost is just a small amount of damage in comparison to things like Nex, or Gatekeeper, or even Rhodos. This is absolutely recommended if you just want a little bit of CDR. On the other hand, you can go Gatekeeper or raw elemental damage to increase the damage of all your skills. However, it can be very expensive to optimize, as you will likely want all elemental damage enchants for consistent damage output. And Nex is just also raw damage increases, just 5% modifiers across the board, no utility whatsoever, but this is a great budget option compared to Gatekeeper, as you aren't forced to use all elemental damage enchants. You can just use dual or even single LE enchant instead. This can save you quite a bit of money and is just a pretty underrated set. I would say Rhodos is mostly unnecessary. Demon Slayer doesn't particularly scale well with attack speed. Just the amount of attack speed you get from your base 100 equipment and your avatars and your buffer and party content is enough. She doesn't necessarily need this for any of her skills, but this can be a viable option if this is all you have. And the extra utility can be useful. For example, the super armor. And finally, we have Roxy. This is actually highly recommended if you have a setup geared towards burst damage. For example, if you have Secret Watcher Mythic or Dimensional Traveler Mythic, and you're using 3-piece Secret Watcher of the Abyss, you just have a bunch of levels to your awakenings. Roxy increases the damage of your awakenings by a staggering 17% each, 10% for your third awakening. This is very, very strong, and it will increase your overall burst damage in a 30-second window, maybe even 40 seconds, because Demon Slayer's awakenings are in fact absolutely powerful. That said, they will do nothing for your sustained damage, so please keep that in mind. And that's about it. To recap, the Demon Slayer is an incredibly powerful burst damage class with decent sustained damage capabilities. Although she's relatively straightforward, her skills can feel very satisfying to land, making her quite enjoyable to play. So if you're into that, please give her a fair try. She has a bit of a rocky start with her low amount of AoEs and just generally high cooldowns, but she can become a very gratifying class to play. Please give her a shot. If you have any questions regarding this class, please drop a comment below. You can also join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to below as well. And you can also catch me live on Twitch if you'd like to ask me anything directly. I stream almost every day, generally after 5 or 6 p.m. Pacific, so hopefully I'll see you there. Otherwise, have a good one. Cheers, guys.